Hello everyone, welcome to the internally screening review of Haxan. My name's Adam.
My name's Rupert.
And today we are continuing our Hooptober list. This month we're going through reviewing a film every day, if we can manage it. So far we've been doing alright, and so today we're satisfying the 6 countries and 8 decades with a 1920s Swedish silent movie, Haxan, or The Witch in its native Swedish. An intriguing silent film. It's almost reenactment documentary in some ways of witchcraft, the history of witchcraft and the superstition around would-be witches. It takes you on this quite sort of powerful journey in a sort of episodic format. It's like drenched in atmosphere. Obviously, because it's silent, it relies hugely on its soundtrack, and its soundtrack is impeccable. It really adds layers of atmosphere to this thing, and the visuals are quite something. They're really quite spectacular. Something super creepy and dreamlike about it, again aided by the silent aesthetic. I found it to be very powerful. Rupert, what did you think of Haxan?
Yeah, I absolutely loved it. I don't have too much experience with anything from this period. I've seen basic stuff like Nosferatu, but I'm not a huge 1920s film buff, so I was actually really looking forward to watching this. And yeah, it is kind of documentary-esque, but I'd actually say it's closer to like a video essay than it is a documentary.
Yeah, that's
because what I was sort of taken aback by this film was obviously, like a lot of 1920s films, the way the dialogue is shown is with title cards across the screen. It almost reminded me of like an Adam Curtis documentary with the titles he uses in between, where it's very video essay like, and the person, I presume it's Benjamin Christensen, the director, is just talking directly to you. It's like got lots of fourth wall breaks in terms of the text. It's almost just talking straight at you most of the time, which I thought was quite interesting, because more than anything, this film is just quite educational. I don't know how solid all the history on this is, but this is a lot of stuff that I'd read about during late night tired Wikipedia binges.
Sessions.
Yeah, just because that's the kind of weirdo I am. It's pretty much perfectly aimed for my taste, because I find all this stuff really interesting anyways. And it touched on a lot of stuff that I've been quite interested in. But actually, what surprised me more than anything with this film was like how kind of sweet and touching it was in the end, while also being quite foreboding and like a warning. I found it like genuinely very entertaining. I wasn't ever really very bored by it, and I just thought it was incredibly unique and deeply enjoyable. I agree with pretty much everything you said. I will say on the soundtrack, it's quite interesting you mentioned that, because I believe we both watched the YouTube version of this.
Yes.
So, like a lot of 1920s films, this didn't come with a soundtrack, so it would have been whatever was being played in the cinema, which would have been given out. So there's multiple different versions of this, and I started off watching this on the Criterion channel, and it had a completely different soundtrack, which I wasn't really vibing with. So then I went to the YouTube version, and I agree that the soundtrack for that was much better. The Criterion one is more like classical music.
I see.
It's a little bit sort of more. It felt initially. I didn't watch the whole thing with that music, so I don't know if it changes. But initially, it felt sort of quite weirdly upbeat. It felt a bit weird. Okay. So yeah, I switched to the YouTube version, and I agree, it worked really well. I don't know what the music, who it was by or anything.
It's like this sort of dark ambient kind of. To my memory, it was still like largely sort of classical instrumentation, but used in a really sinister, foreboding setting. I guess quite sort of non-traditional, especially for something made in the 20s. So I don't know if it's like era appropriate. Now that you've brought it up, I'd never even considered that this wouldn't have been the original music. But
here's the thing, it doesn't matter, because at the end of the day, this isn't a film that was actually, it doesn't come with music, so you can kind of just play whatever music you want to it, and whatever works goes, because it wasn't made with music, you know.
Yeah, that's that's really interesting. I hadn't even considered. But the soundtrack, this dark ambient, heavy, but also kind of unintrusive at the same time. It really serves to color the scenes and add depth rather than be overtly distracting or overwhelming. The version that's up on YouTube is impeccable.
I think the other thing you mentioned was the visuals, and The visuals are great. So the film opens with a lot of medieval paintings of hell. I've always found those quite interesting because they're always quite strange and weird and scary.
Yeah.
And then a lot of the visuals in the films, particularly sort of towards the middle of the film, it has this kind of quite long sequence of witchcraft at night as this woman is being tortured to confess about what she's witnessed.
Yeah.
And some of the visuals, you've got these like crazy silhouette shots, which look obviously quite old-timey, but I think they're pretty beautiful. And then you've got these like insane sets with all this chaos going on. With like
amazing
these
stuff.
Yeah, like these demons like running around and these women like kissing Satan on the arse, and like
The costume design is unbelievable.
It is
really
crazy.
fantastic.
Yeah, it's so good. Yeah, it just kind of had me under its spell. It was like at times genuinely quite unnerving. It was never like scary, I'd say, but it's more like it's a little unsettling at points.
Oh yeah. No. I found this to be deeply eerie. I think eerie is the perfect word for this. Like, never scary, but like kind of threatening and foreboding in a kind of, dare I say, cosmic horror kind of way. We always have a little bit of that with religion, right? It feels a bit cliche to keep saying it, but there was a Lovecraftian element to it, you know? I mean, you can't really credit Lovecraft with coming up with witchcraft, of course, but the general sense of something mystical and completely inexplicable to the human experience, and told in this dreamlike form as well. Like, you kind of felt like you were moving through something you had no control over, but you felt more involved in it because you weren't necessarily witnessing characters, you were just seeing like images. It's like a strangely involving experience in a way that movies with audio aren't in the same way.
Yeah, because you do really have to focus on this because you're obviously reading a good amount of the time.
Yeah.
I also thought, it does have this really sort of sinister, mystical tone to it, which is great. But I also kind of like that it's not one tone the whole time. It's actually fairly long for a silent film of this time, I think, generally. Although there are some really long ones, I could be wrong on that. It also has kind of a sense of humour to it.
Yeah.
Like the scene where the witch is helping a woman seduce this fat priest, which was just like quite sort of very silly and charming. But there were also like a couple of other gags, and I think one bit, I'm not even sure if it was supposed to be funny. I don't know if you remember this, the bit where there's a scene and the title card says, "Here's what's happening, and I hope I didn't shoot this too darkly on the white screen for you." That was hilarious to me. I don't know like what was going on because it looked fine, but I just thought it was quite funny. The director being like, "Oh, I hope I set this shot up quite all right for you, dear audience," and then another bit that actually made me like actually giggle to myself a bit was the bit where he just randomly cuts and he's like, one of the actresses insisted on trying the thumb screw, and then it shows you her like, you know, they're playing around with the thumb screw, and he goes, "I won't tell you what confessions that she brought out after me using this on her." I just thought it was like genuinely quite funny as well.
Yeah, that was, I guess, kind of added to that documentarian video essay thing. Like you were saying, you know, this fourth wall breaking aspect. It was very interesting. It was like, I guess, the most consistent character in the film is your narrator. It's just that the narrator has no voice. It
made the film very interesting. I guess it's also just this is probably just the thing that's come with time. But if you'd have watched this at release, you wouldn't have got this at all, I don't think. But looking back on it, because this film is so old, like 100 years old, the way the film moves from these medieval tapestries and paintings in the beginning and kind of giving you this history lesson into these very statically shot, kind of sepia tone, kind of muddy but still like really detailed and dense and beautiful images with this like amazing set design and this great character costume stuff. But it's all shot on this like really old-fashioned way. I think I only noticed one moment where the camera even moved, which obviously probably wouldn't have been that easy to do at the time. It really gives you that feeling of like you're almost like looking into the past, and it really does kind of feel like you've dug up this old relic, and it's really fascinating. If you're into history, I don't think I could recommend this highly enough, because you're watching a piece of film history that is also teaching you about history.
Yeah,
so
that
it really satisfies me on like both levels.
Yeah, no, I found that level to it to be like a deeply interesting sort of, not contradiction, but more just the evolution of human ideas. I think for the age, this film was quite... We talked earlier about how the note the film ends on is actually quite sweet and thoughtful, because essentially it says, here is a sort of a history of witchcraft, but then at the midpoint it kind of twists towards the witch trials of completely innocent people, and it puts this spin of like, these people were innocent and they were abused and coerced by a corrupt religious organization into admitting things that could not possibly be true. And at the end, it's like it offers a then modern alternative diagnosis, which is that they all have hysteria, which I kind of giggled at, because I was like, well, this film, like, obviously the notion of hysteria is so old-fashioned, but for then it was treating people with this like level of empathy and respect and care that people would not necessarily have seen before, and also being like weirdly prescient about mental health issues.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
It's obviously done in a really old-fashioned way, but it's based off the understandings they had back then. Like, the film itself seems very noble and kind-hearted in that way of saying history has treated women so awfully. If you're an old, ugly woman, you're a witch. If you're a young, beautiful woman, you're a witch. You can't do anything. You know, it's only a matter of time before a man looks at you the wrong way and decides you're a fucking witch. And I guess extrapolated that at the very end into this modern context, a then modern context. And it was, deeply, deeply fascinating insight. And I feel like a film like this could only have come out from Scandinavia or somewhere like where the taboos could be broken in that way. Because could you imagine America making a film like this in the 20s?
Well, I think at the time, I think I've read that this, I briefly skimmed the Wikipedia for this page, and I think it did say that this film was not widely shown at the time. One of the reasons being it being like critical of the clergy. So, I mean, this really was, ye olden days. I think this is more a film that's kind of been retrospectively appreciated more than something that was really praised at the time.
That doesn't surprise me.
Yeah, I do agree. I think that the ending is like a very nice spin on it, because this film is clearly, it kind of satisfies that primal, or I guess instinctual, or that Macbeth fascination that I think a lot of people just have with witchcraft. The imagery and the emotion that it evokes. There is just something innately fascinating and creepy and funny and just really evocative about witchcraft and witches, and it clearly loves to revel in the imagery, because you have that big sequence in the middle where she's confessing and you're seeing all this like mayhem and people dancing and all this sort of debauchery. I love that it manages to balance that and like completely use all that imagery to maximum effect, but also do this essentially like mental health retrospective look at things, where the director even talks directly to his own experiences, saying that he knew a woman who used to sleepwalk, and then fully like goes and explains that at the time the bizarre compulsion she had to sleepwalk and strike matches, if you did not understand it or you didn't think critically about it, you could think, well, that's witchcraft. And at the time, in the Dark Ages, in the medieval ages, it was a stressful time. And one really interesting thing about the film that it covers is the Dark Ages dancing plague, where a nun in a chapel starts stabbing this, I don't know what it is, it's like a small effigy of Jesus. She has this strange compulsion, and that's the comparison he draws, like she could have been sleepwalking for a woman. And then all of the nuns go crazy and start dancing, and that's a real thing that might have apparently happened. There's like reports of like in Europe of, just because these were the times where you had the Black Plague and all these wars and conditions for people were just awful, and it's thought that like these episodes of like mass psychosis, there were like these strange references to this like dancing plague where people just started dancing. It is quite creepy,
suffering from like mass trauma, and at the time obviously people were like far more superstitious and less knowledgeable, so they were just jumping to the first conclusion that made sense to them, which is a point the film makes early on, where it says in medieval times belief in the devil made him more real. And so they found his presence everywhere because they were so terrified of him. And it fueled that superstition so deeply.
I just think this film, not only is it just fascinating in and of itself, but I think it actually offers a lot of insight and interesting analysis. It's not like the most deep analysis of it. I guess it could have gone into more detail, but like for what it is, I think it like absolutely nails what it's going for. Right. And it offers plenty of spectacle. It offers plenty of introspection and analysis. And yeah, I loved it.
So what would you give it, Rupert?
I'm hovering on an 8, but I could honestly see myself boosting this to a 9. I'm between an 8 and a 9.
Wow.
I really, really liked it.
Damn. I will say I'm probably not as positive on it as you. As much as I just generally enjoyed the film, I did need a couple of sittings to get through. I found the pace of it to be quite slow and drawn out. And whilst I can't really hold it against it because everything it has to say is interesting and it's incredibly informative, but it was quite like draining and patience testing at points, which is why I think it's interesting that it's kind of shown in these like part 1, part 2, parts to 7 or whatever. It seems to work in that format, and I'm intrigued as to whether it was ever released in those formats, like incrementally.
I don't think so. It might have been for intermissions or something.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. I mean, it just seems unusual you would pace your film in that way without it being segmented.
I just don't know how it could have been distributed at the time in shorter segments, because obviously...
So yeah, I guess it being a little boring in its like length and pace kind of held me back from loving it more. But at the same time, I can't really hold anything else against it. Like, I don't think there's anything particularly wrong beyond that. And I, like you say, I think this discussion has affirmed the things I liked about it and strengthened what I believe is great about this film. So I could see myself returning to it, where before I didn't really have much of an urge to it. I felt like I'd gotten all I needed to get out of it, but your passion for it has urged me on. So I think I'd give this a 7 out of 10.
Okay, fair enough. I mean, you know, everyone's allowed to be wrong once in a while, you know.
I would like to highlight though my personal favourite part of the film, which is the stuff that specifically attacks the clergy, where we have the young woman who is being sort of coerced into giving this false...
Oh yeah, that's a good bit, yeah.
I really loved that bit, and the bit preceding that, which you've already mentioned, where the old woman gives this testimony. And I think what's interesting...
That bit was my favourite bit, plus the ending sequence, plus the nun stabbing the thing, and then the dancing. I love that shot of them all just like going mental and dancing towards the camera. I just thought that was great.
I really like the implication in the confession that everything she was saying was completely fabricated. Like, there's an interpretation where basically everything the film has told you up to this point about like witchcraft, about it being this demonic thing, is just people's insecurities or superstitions rather. Sure, there were people out there making potions, but it wasn't necessarily demonic or anything. Like the transition it makes from here is the history of witchcraft as though it were sort of factual into, well, actually, here's the reality of it, was really powerful. And in that moment, I think particularly you got this idea of this is an innocent woman trying to get herself out of a situation, or forced into a position where all she can say is something ridiculous because they won't believe anything else.
Well, I like the bit at the end where it also points out that people were just generally superstitious, and all it took was bad interpretation. So, like, you know, people did this thing where if they wanted someone to have a bad marriage, they would tie a knot above the bed, the marriage bed or something. Or leave a hot cross under the bed, which is just general superstitions, which a lot of people would, you know, engage in this behaviour and they wouldn't consider it witchcraft. You would only consider it witchcraft if the suspicion was then raised on you, and then it's witchcraft retrospectively, even though it was just a very commonly superstitious, maybe like a kind of pagan belief that had just sort of trickled down. And it was more of a cultural practice separate from the religious stuff. So, I mean, obviously, it's the kind of stuff we take for granted now, because I don't think many people are being burnt for witchcraft these days, but it's still like, it still feels weirdly sort of the message of it and the overall sense of people doing something strange and then being punished for it, and then there's actually this other explanation, and, you know, all you really need to do is be empathetic to understand that. That's still like a valuable message. And like still, you know, applicable to a lot of things in the modern day, right? So I think that's what makes the film so great overall.
Well, there we have it, a pretty glowing review overall. I'm up there with Possum for one of our favourite films so far of this horror film odyssey that we have departed on. I hope you enjoyed it. I can't imagine this film to have been particularly well known, so, you know, if you haven't
probably
seen
a bit of an acquired taste.
I mean, obviously, you know, if you're interested in by what you've heard from our review, by all means check it out. It is on YouTube and it is episodic, so, you know, if you do find the pacing a bit taxing, just take it in little doses. But it is a very interesting historical piece. If you like this review, drop a like. Please do. Subscribe, by all means. If you didn't like this review, and I don't know why you wouldn't, a review where we're heaping praise on this film, but maybe you just hate old things. I don't know. In which case, yeah, slap a dislike. Why not? And we will be here tomorrow to review something else incredibly spooky. I've been Adam.
I've been Rupert.
And we'll catch you next time. Peace.
Peace.